This Harley Benton is objectively better than a Gibson Les Paul. Hey everybody, Jayce Allan here. Welcome back to the channel. So if you've been following the entire Dylan Talks Tone Harley Benton scandal, should we call it Harley Benton Gate? I think we should. Anyway, if you've been watching that saga unfold, you probably know that Dylan and I sit on opposite sides of this issue. I'm one of the, as he likes to call them, just as good as guys, where Dylan likes to say that a Gibson Les Paul is objectively better than, say, a Harley Benton LP style guitar. I see that term used a fair amount in the comments of my videos. In fact, here's a comment from Bud Kingston 3347, and he says, Dylan has a problem with the HB guys because many use the phrase "as good as," a phrase that is objectively wrong. You yourself clearly said the pickups were muddy, an objective statement. The pickups are made to a price point, not anywhere as good as anything. Sorry, Bud, if it seems like I'm singling you out, but so many people like to use the term objectively to explain that expensive guitars are better than budget guitars. But most of you are using the term incorrectly. Notice how Bud quoted me as saying that the Harley Benton pickup sounded muddy, and he said that that was an objective statement, when in fact, pickup tone and how we each perceive it is a very classic example of something that is purely subjective, not objective. The internet defines the word objective as looking at or judging things based purely on real facts. It means you do not let your own feelings, personal likes, or biases change your view. Well, folks, we're all biased when it comes to guitars and guitar brands, so there is almost nothing objective when it comes to discussing guitars. This is a $100 bill. It is objectively more money than this $50 bill. Those are two things that cannot be disputed. That is factual information. Now consider this. A Gibson Les Paul might be made from a single piece of mahogany. In fact, my Heritage H150 has a solid one-piece genuine mahogany body. The Harley Benton there has a Meranti body, and I have to assume it's at least a couple of pieces. So does that mean that the Heritage or a Gibson are objectively better than the Harley Benton? Mahogany is certainly objectively more expensive than Meranti, and under certain use cases, mahogany can be more durable than Meranti. But in the context of a guitar body, is mahogany better simply because it's more money? Does genuine mahogany sound objectively better than Meranti? Bud went on to say, I initially used the word subjective but changed it to objective because it is. You can measure and adjust frequencies to clean up pickups by adding a resistor to filter out specific frequencies. You can measure eddy current effect in base plates, be they aluminum, brass, or nickel silver. You can measure magnet effect. Perhaps it is subjective, but it's the rare person that seeks out that muddy tone. If I measure the resistance of the pickups in my Heritage H150, I see that the bridge pickup, a Seymour Duncan, is 7.99 ohms of resistance, while the Harley Benton measures 9.23 ohms. Does that make the Harley Benton better? Is a higher number better? It's measurable. We can factually prove that the Harley Benton has a higher resistance than my H150. Fralin Pickups claims the longer the wire is, i.e. more turns per coil, the higher the resistance will be. By that logic, the Harley Benton actually has more copper wire in the bridge pickup. So is that better? But then Fralin Pickups also state that magnet strength, temperature, and wire gauge will also affect resistance. So maybe measuring the resistance of a pickup isn't so objective after all. In fact, Fralin Pickups also says that resistance does not define the output of the pickup because the output of the pickup is affected by the number of turns of wire and the magnet strength. Both the Harley Benton and the H150 there have Alnico pickups. So they're both the same, right? And what about that muddy tone I mentioned in my video? Well, yesterday I took the Harley Benton to band practice and it sounded fantastic through my Fender Deluxe tube amp. So does that mean the Harley Benton will sound different depending on the amp that it's plugged into? What about an EQ pedal? Can I match the tone of another pickup with EQ? If so, how can you objectively compare the tone of two guitars if the method for which we present that tone can vary from amp to amp or even with the use of effects pedals? Okay, then it must be the hardware. The H150 over there has Grover tuners and the Harley Benton, whatever tuners. I guess just cheap Chinese made tuners. So are the Grover tuners objectively better? I guess if they last longer than the tuners on the Harley Benton, then you could argue that they are better. What's that smell?
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
Well, what I'm smelling and you're not is called nitrocellulose. The H150 has a nitro finish that even 2 years after I bought it is still outgassing. The Harley Benton has a poly finished, so that must make the H150 objectively better, right? Well, not so fast. I find nitro finishes get sticky the longer you play them at one time. If I play the H150 for a couple hours like I played the Harley Benton yesterday at band practice, the sweat and oils from my hands react with the nitro finish and it gets tacky, which I'm not a fan of. So for me, nitro finishes are definitely not better. Okay, but the Heritage or even a Gibson is better because they both have solid maple caps, where the Harley Benton is just a thin veneer. But if you look at my H150, a guitar that cost $2,600 at the time, the top doesn't actually have a lot of flame in it, and it isn't book matched at all, while the Harley Benton top looks stunning and is almost perfectly book matched. Does that make the Harley Benton objectively better simply because it looks nicer? I'm not sure too many people would agree with that. They would say that the solid maple cap on the Heritage is objectively better. They would tell us that Heritage and Gibsons and Fenders use better metals, better woods, better craftsmanship, and are therefore objectively better. I visited the Heritage factory when I picked out my H150, and they are craftsmen and women. They use a mix of CNC machining and hand building techniques to craft these guitars. They are inspired by the Gibson Les Pauls that used to be made in that very factory. I would argue that that makes the Heritage Les Paul more of a Les Paul than an actual Gibson Les Paul, objectively. But then again, the hardcore Gibson fans would disagree. Does the headstock logo make one guitar objectively better than another? Maybe sales determine which are better. That's something measurable. Thomanns is the largest music retailer in the EU, and Harley Benton sells a lot of guitars. Sales data can be hard to come by, but would that alone settle the debate? How about playability? That must surely be objective, right? Well, the H150 weighs 10 pounds and doesn't sit in the user's lap very well. It's quite bottom heavy. The Harley Benton has a chambered body, so does that make it better? In fact, now Heritage is building the H150 Standard 2, which features, you guessed it, a chambered body. The truth is, a guitar is a subjective instrument. There's really nothing about one that you can say is objectively better than another. You could say, well, those cheap guitars don't have Alnico magnets. They use cheaper ceramic, but ceramic pickups are often higher output, and many people like that. So to them, ceramic pickups are ideal. You could argue, well, basswood is cheap firewood, yet many people prefer basswood bodies due to their light weight. Again, does wood type, number of pieces of wood in the body, type of magnets in the pickups, or brand of tuners make one guitar objectively better than another? When most people point to one guitar being objectively better than another, it usually has the name Gibson or Fender stamped on the headstock. They are measuring all other guitars based on these legacy brands. They haven't been able to move past the idea that a good or even great guitar can be made by a company other than Fender or Gibson, and can also be made somewhere other than the United States. Heritage guitars are a perfect example of that. They are made here in the USA, but because they're not owned by a US company and they are copying Gibson, many people look down on the Heritage brand and even go so far as to call them junk, which is pretty hilarious considering they are made from some of the finest woods and other materials that you can get. But again, does that make a guitar objectively better than another? I'm going to leave that for you to decide in the comments. Let me know what you think. I appreciate you for tuning in. This is Jayce Allan for Jayce Allan Guitar, and we'll leave the amp on for you.